Good afternoon, everyone, and once again, a warm welcome to this second webinar of 2021. This webinar is going to cover data parameters, the what, why, where, and how of data parameters, and we will also quickly discuss some aspects of a question that was asked in the last webinar. So just a very quick overview of what's in this webinar. We're going to just give a quick introduction to data parameters, explain why they are needed and what they are. And this is specifically just to give context to very new users to JunoViewer that have never worked in JunoViewer before. Really, you can't get very far doing anything in JunoViewer unless you have data parameters defined and understand what they are. But also for some of the old users that already are familiar with data parameters, it's a good maybe to have a refresher and understand exactly why they exist. I'll go to just give a quick demonstration and show the effects of changing a data parameter in JunoViewer. And then we will just go back and discuss how to show maintenance overlay on a trend graph. And this was just based on a question in the last webinar that we didn't really have time to completely answer, and then we'll take questions again. So why data parameters? I'm going to just explain the background to that, to consider a case where we want to draw a very simple scatter plot using some data in a database. So maybe imagine that you are, for one day of your life, you are actually a software developer and you've got a database and you have a task to develop a simple scatter plot that allows a user to go into the database and go and select a specific data column in the database to draw a scatter plot on. Now, if you want to do that, what are the steps that you have to go through? So first of all, you have your database. And of course, in your database, you're going to have different tables representing your different data types like rutting, roughness, texture, FWD, and so on. So in a typical JunoViewer database, you can have 10, 20, 50 tables, depending on how many custom tables you've created inside of your JunoViewer database. So the first step that you will want a user to do is to select a table. So for example, if a user wants to go to a specific section on the network and have a look at the texture, how the texture depth varies over that section, they will first have to go to some sort of a drop-down and select the table from which the data must come. So they're going to select the texture table. You can see I've highlighted that over here. The texture table is now selected. Now they have to go into a second drop-down and select a column. So that drop-down is going to show all of the columns in this table that they can plot. And maybe you've got 50 columns in a table. So that's a fairly long drop down, and you're going to have to go down and find the column that you want to plot. Then you're going to click on OK, and you are going to draw your graph. Now you notice that the graph axis is not right, okay? Because this graph axis goes from 0 to 100. But as all of you probably know, texture depth is something that varies between about 0 and 3 millimeters. And so you have to adjust your scale. So now you've got to present the user with some sort of an input screen that allows them to edit the y-axis limits. So they have to put in a value for the minimum, the maximum, and the increment. Again, click on OK after they've done that. And now there's your graph with your axis limits properly defined. So it took you 5 steps to just get to this graph that you want to see on this specific section of road. But what if you want to see for that same section, you are in a hurry and you want to see rutting, roughness, texture, FWD, and so on? Then you're going to have to repeat these 5 steps for every one of them. And that includes each time adjusting your y-axis limits. So that's where data parameters come in JunoViewer. So JunoViewer data parameters are basically a shortcut that points you to a specific table in your database and a specific column in that table. Secondly, it is a predefined setup for graphs, which specifies for you a y-axis lower limit, upper limit, and an increment. And in addition to that, it also gives you a predefined setup to interpret your data using a typical traffic light type of signal that goes from red to green showing data in good to poor condition. So let's go to JunoViewer and look at these principles in action. So here I am in my JunoViewer training account, and I'm just going to use, once again, for this week's webinar, I'm going to focus on the trend report as an example of using the data parameters. But I will also illustrate for you that the same principle applies also to something like the scatter plot. So if you can just go to Analyze and click on Trend Report, and you open this trend report. And then let's go and select the same segment that we selected in last week's webinar, which let's just select this one, section 003, subsection 0000. We select all lanes, and we're going to look at kilometer 14.5 to 15. So if you click on OK, now I've selected here the texture, the parameter is the texture mean in the left wheel path. And you can see that in this case, my data actually lies in a fairly narrow range between 0 and just about over 3, right? Now, if I go and select a different data parameter, for example, if I go to rut, the mean in the left wheel path, now you will see that this axis automatically is going to change to whatever this data parameter has been set to. Okay, so you can see the axis limits have automatically changed. The color coding has already automatically changed. And the reason why that happens fairly seamlessly is because what I am selecting in these drop-down boxes are not simply columns in certain tables, but they are actually data parameters, which, as I've explained before, is a shortcut to a specific table and a specific column, and also containing then the limits for the axis. So let's go and look at where we define data parameters and delve a little bit into the definition of them. So under the Manage menu, you will find data parameters. All right, so at the top menu under Manage, you go to Data Parameters. And the Data Parameters window will open for you. Now, notice that those of you that are working in the training account, for these webinars, you have been given only a basic user access. So this means that you cannot actually change anything in JunoViewer. You can view data and you can view certain types of information, but you do not have permission to actually modify things. In a later webinar, we will specifically cover the different types of user roles that you have in JunoViewer. For example, if you are a administrator, you will have access to basically change anything in JunoViewer. But as you can imagine, if we have got a webinar, and for this webinar, I think we've got more than 40 people participating, if everyone starts adding data parameters at the same time while I'm working here, it's going to be chaos. Okay, so at this stage, we are limiting the permissions for users in the training account, but please rest assured that in later webinars where we delve into more details, we will try to keep the group a little bit smaller, and we will allow some of you to actually be able to modify things in the training account so that you can get actual practice. The other thing that I want to add, if you are new to JunoViewer and you don't have your own account and you would like to practice a little bit to modify data parameters, please send us an email. Just give us your details. We'll give you access for a week or so with a high permission level in the training account so that you can actually play around a little bit with these settings. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go to this parameter that we've looked at, the texture mean in left wheel path. And you remember when I showed that graph, the data was basically limited to just over 2 millimeters, but the range of this parameter has varied from 0 to 3.6. So what I'm going to do is to modify this parameter right here by saying the axis minimum stays 0, but the maximum I just want to be 2.5, and the axis increment I want to be 0.25. The number of decimals will determine how many decimals are being showed shown on the axis, and this also will apply to certain of your data exports and things like that. So I'm going to make this 2 decimals since my axis increment contains 2 decimals. And here I can see the color coding for different ranges. So if my texture depth is below 0.3, it will be red. If it's from 0.3 to 5, it will be red, and from 0.5 to 0.7, also red. So let's go and change that. Let's say that we regard a texture depth of less than 0.3 as really bad, and then 0.3 to 0.5 as warning. So let's make that an orange. 0.5 to 0.7, we can say is a yellow. 0.7 to 1 is now already fairly good. And anything above 1, notice I set a fairly high upper limit here. Let's make that a nice dark green. Now here we can change the transparency or the opacity of the colors. You can see there on the screen, that's the way that the colors will be overlaid. So if we go to set it to have a very high opacity, and I go and update this parameter now. So I've updated this parameter. If I go back to the trend graph now, trend report, and just take note that I'm working here on texture mean in left wheel path. That's the name of the parameter. So if I go to my trend report and I go and select that parameter once again, texture mean in left wheel path, and I draw my graph. Now you can see here I've got a graph which the axis has been nicely adjusted. You can see the colors that I've defined there, but you can see that the opacity of these colors are so dark that the colors basically overwhelm the data. So I can just go back and go to the manage page again, go back to data parameters, go and select this data parameter here, texture mean in left wheel path. And all I need to do is just push this opacity down a little bit to make it lighter, update the parameter, and I can go back and view this again in the trend report. Now, the one thing about data parameters that's quite convenient, but sometimes it is also a little bit of an inconvenience, is that if you are an administrator on your JunoViewer system, or you've also got data manager permissions, then you will be allowed to actually modify your data parameters. When you modify a data parameter, those changes will be reflected for all users in your organization. In other words, data parameters are not user-specific, they are organization-specific. This has got the advantage that everybody in the organization is looking at data in the same way, but it's got the disadvantage that sometimes for certain sections on a specific road, you may want to have some sort of an exceptional circumstance. A very common one is, for example, if you are looking at rutting. I'll just try and find a rut graph here, which has got fairly high rutting. So you can see this graph has got fairly high rutting. So if most of the rut on your network is less than 30, then maybe you will set up your data parameter to have a maximum access limit of 30. In this case, this graph is going to be cut off there. And that's something that you may want to have a parameter for 2 different cases. Let's say for 2 categories of road or 2 different scenarios. And the users can then just choose which of those they actually want to use. So before I finish off on data parameters, I just want to go back to the data parameters page and just reiterate again for you that a data parameter is a shortcut to a table and to a specific column. So let's say I want to add a new parameter. I'm going to click on this button here, which you probably cannot see if you are in the training account. And I need to give a name for the parameter. So I'm just going to call this test rut. And you'll see it's asking me here for the source table. So this is the table that's going to be my source table. And I can see all the tables here that have been defined properly in my database. So I'm going to choose from the rutting table, and my source column. In this case, I'm going to make this left wheel path mean rut. Right, so there's my shortcut with the name of my parameter is test rut. The table is the rutting, and the source column is this column over here. So once I've put that in, I can now go and set my access limit. So for example, for this parameter, I can make it to go from 0 to 25 with an increment of 5 millimeters, and I only want to show 1 decimal. And I can now set up my typical ranges, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 15 to 20, and then always make sure that your last bin here is going to catch everything that you can possibly find in your database. And again, I'm going to set the opacity down, and I'm just quickly going to set these bins going from dark green for low rut, lighter green, just typical traffic light system, yellow, orange, and this one I can make red. And I'm going to update that parameter. And now if I go back again to my trend report, I will be able to see test rut. That's the parameter I've just created. Select my segment. And now you can see, because I've made my upper limit at that point, you can see that these very high ruts are being cut off. The data parameters are used quite comprehensively in JunoViewer. Whenever you need to somewhere select some column to do something, whether it's a join parameter or maybe calculating deterioration rates, you always use data parameters as a shortcut to point to that specific column in your database. So it's very important that you are comfortable with it and get it under the belt. So that is basically everything I think that we wanted to cover in the time we've got available. One other thing that I want to just talk about is last week we had a question about showing maintenance information on a graph. So for example, on a trend graph. So for example, if I've got a graph like this, I can overlay maintenance data on that. And there was a question about how you can actually control certain elements of this overlay of maintenance. And that I just want to very quickly show you. We will have a separate webinar on that. So I'm not going to delve too much into the details, but the key thing to note is that what is being displayed for you here can be controlled under the Manage page and then Manage XML Setup. So if you go to Manage XML Setup, and in this page, you go to Maintenance Actions. And once again, some of you in the training account may not have access to this page. But for those of you that are data managers and administrators, this is quite important. So you'll see here that this XML basically controls what is being displayed in that overlay information. So for example, over here, you can see there's a setting which says, do you want to show the label, right? And if I'm just going to go and edit this setup, and I just go in there and set that to false, and click on OK, and I save this. If I go back to my trend graph now, then you will see that all of those labels that were being displayed are now gone. So you can control elements of this overlay of maintenance and surfacing data through this Manage XML page. Now, if you go to the JunoViewer help page, or to the online JunoViewer help, so help.junoviewerweb.com, and you just search for trend graph view, then you will find details of exactly what that XML setup needs to be looking like to see certain displays on your graph. Similarly, if you go and search for data parameters, there's a page about data parameters where if there's anything that I've just explained, if I've gone a little bit too fast, please go and have a look at this help page, and I'm sure you'll find everything there that, that you need to be able to use data parameters quite effectively. So I think that's it. I promise that we will try to keep this webinar short. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and yeah, have a nice week and have a nice weekend.